This is madness. What can you have been thinking? You are the Slayer. Lives depend upon you. I make allowances for your youth, but I expect a certain amount of responsibility, and instead of which you enslave yourself to this cult.
You don't like the color?
Rightfully considered one of the best episodes of Season 1, which has a lot going for it. First of all, this is the first episode that looks like the Buffy we remember. The actors, since the pilot, have honed down their characters some more to the characters that we know and love. We also meet yet another character that will be with us all the way to Season 7, their schoolmate, Amy. The in-group dynamics are already in sync, the dialogue is snappy, the humor is crackling, the plot keeps us guessing, and the action is pretty suspenseful, all the things that Joss Whedon is so good at. The show will still take some time perfecting some of its other aspects, but this is enough to keep us going until we get there. Some important things are established. First of all, the unrequited love triangle, which was only hinted at in the pilot, here becomes a fixture. Willow wants Xander, but he thinks of her as...
That's why you're so cool, you're like a guy. You're my guy friend that knows about girl stuff.
Oh, great. I'm a guy.
Which then comes right back at him, because he wants Buffy, but she thinks of him as...
Do you have any idea why I love you so, Xander?
You gotta get her to
Let her speak.
I'll tell you. You're not like other boys at all.
Well,
You are totally and completely one of the girls. I'm that comfy with him.
Another important thing we learn is that magic and witchcraft are real, and that Giles has experience in them. This show isn't going to be just about vampires. Finally, we learn more about Buffy's home situation, and we see that Joyce is running and curating an art gallery, trying to start it anew in this town, which is not easy to do while having to parent a troublesome teenage daughter. Apart from that, this episode is a girl-on-girl tackle-palooza. First there's Buffy, with this totally excessive tackle on Amber. Then she tackles Cordy. This one is more justified. And finally there's Catherine tackling Buffy, which really makes no sense when she can just turn her into a toad. But never mind that. The reason these girls do the tackling is that they have some issues that cause them to act witchy and bitchy towards each other. Let's tackle those issues. Again, like most early episodes of the show, the story is a metaphor for the problems teenagers might face. This time, it is a metaphor for parents who demand of their kids to follow in their footsteps, or even want to live vicariously through their kids, told through a story about a witch mother who literally possesses her daughter's body so she can relive her glory days as a cheerleader. We all know this, but I want to focus on something else. I want to show how through this story, a bigger story is being told, a story that was especially prevalent in the rock and roll period, the story of the relationship between generations.
Look what I found. It's my yearbook from junior year. Oh, look. There I am.
Mom, I've accepted that you've had sex. I am not ready to know that you had Farrah hair.
This is Gidget hair. Don't they teach you anything in history?
No, they really don't. So, here's a little history lesson. You might find this a tad boring, but it is an essential background to the analyses that I shall provide in the future. Remember, part of this project's mission is to ground Buffy in a wider cultural context, understand its historical significance. So, if you're interested in this analysis I am offering, you should pay close attention to what we shall discuss in this particular video. We are talking about what I call the rock and roll period, which is part of what I call the pop age. Before the pop age came what I, and others, call the modern age. The modern age, by my definition, lasted from 1790 to 1965. The paradigm that ruled the modern age, throughout its different periods, was dominated by the idea of progress, the idea that humanity is marching towards creating heaven on earth. Every generation was seen as building on what the previous generations had done, taking us a step further in the march of progress. But in the last period of the modern age, between the years 1915 and 1965, this paradigm collapsed. The march of progress ended up in the horrors of the two world wars, and in a nuclear arms race that threatened the future of humankind. Meanwhile, this period between 1915 and 1965 was also the first period of the Pop Age. It was a transitional phase between the two ages. While the modern age paradigm, created in Europe, was in decline, the Pop Age paradigm, created in America, was ascending. Since this was still the modern age, the pop mindset still perceived society as progressing, but focused not on creating a better future, but on enjoying the present moment in the march of progress. It was about enhancing the now, making every moment awesome. At first, America's elites still regarded European culture as superior, but after World War II, America found itself as a leader of the Western world, in every way, including culturally. The American elites, still thinking in modern terms, thus saw America as the leader in the march of progress, and 50s society was devised in order to bring the future perfect society. Hence, a big focus was placed on the youth, tomorrow's generation, and how to bring it up the right way. The youth itself, however, had other ideas. Post-war American youth was already deep in the pop mindset, interested more in the present than in the future. This mindset had other defining attributes. While the modern mindset was maintained mainly by the bourgeoisie, those who built a career for themselves and defined themselves mainly by their line of work, the pop mindset belonged to the working class, who didn't really like their line of work, and found their identities in their leisure activities. 50s youth, then, were not into working hard for a better tomorrow, but about creating new activities in their leisure time to have fun right here and now. By the middle of the decade, the West has shaken the last remnants of austerity, and, after 2 very hard decades, entered an age of affluence that allowed the kids to take time to enjoy themselves. This set the stage for the rock and roll period. The rock and roll period begins as white youth start listening to the wildest records of black rhythm and blues, and even form bands of their own to perform them, a hybrid that was named rock and roll. This horrified the culture guardians, as it meant, in their eyes, that progress is being reversed. Instead of being the emissaries of tomorrow, the youth were choosing to go back to the jungle. After the initial rock and roll explosion of 1955 and 56, the original rock and roll started to be repressed, and in its stead, the music industry was quick to offer music for the youth that was a watered-down version of rock and roll. This more vanilla music was what was called rock and roll in the years 1957 to 1963. The film industry, too, started to offer youth flicks, usually musicals based on this fake rock and roll. One such film was Gidget, a 1959 film based on a book written by a contemporary father about the true summer adventures of his daughter. Gidget is a California girl, a good girl who falls prey to peer pressure and starts hanging out with the beach bums, which is what 50s society called surfers. However, all's well that ends well. By the end of the summer, Gidget regains her senses, goes back to normality, and even manages to bring a couple of the guys to leave their pointless lives and assume respectable social roles. This was the first Hollywood youth flick that revolved around surfers, but many more followed. In the early 60s, Hollywood started to cater for the surfers, in surfing movies that didn't portray them as bums, but just as youngsters seeking wholesome fun. The very popular Beach Party franchise showed the new American mindset that started to prevail. It was still expected of the youth to grow up and accept their social roles in the building of a perfect society, but it was now understood that they need a few years to party before they get there. And this is the mentality that ruled the entire rock and roll period.
You have a sacred birthright, Buffy. You were chosen to destroy vampires, not to wave pom-poms at people. And as the Watcher, I forbid it.
And you'll be stopping me how?
By appealing to your common sense, if such a creature exists.
I will still have time to fight the forces of evil, okay? I just want to have a life. I want to do something normal. Something safe.
Giles, already acting as a father figure, expects Buffy to conform right away to the rules of the adult world. Not only that, but he talks here as someone who belongs to the old world, the pre-modern world represented by vampires, in which you are expected to play the role preordained for you by society. Buffy, however, belongs to the rock and roll period, and wants to have some fun in her youth years. We see the inner progress within the period. In the 60s beach party movies, the boys were depicted as wanting to have all fun and no responsibility, while the girls were seen as the responsible ones, who wanted to domesticate the boys, but understood that they have to wait a few years, and in the meantime be willing participants in their shenanigans. But girls were also affected by the spirit of the period, gradually rejecting this role of the responsible one, and by the girl power 90s, they, too, just wanted to have fun. Buffy was all play and no work before she was called. Now she accepts her duties as a slayer, but wants to maintain that other side of hers. Going back to the 60s, the popularity of the beach movies extended to television as well, and Gidget was turned into a TV show in 1965, starring young Sally Field as a teenage protagonist. It is probably this haircut that Joyce had in the yearbook.
Mom, I've accepted that you've had sex. I am not ready to know that you had Farrah hair.
This is Gidget hair. Don't they teach you anything in history?
This teaches us something about Joyce. Unlike Giles, at least the Giles of the first season, she is already part of the rock and roll period, and has its mindset. But she wasn't very hip as a kid. History has forgotten Gidget, which is why Buffy doesn't recognize the haircut, and goes with the closest thing she could think of, the 70s Farrah hair. Why was Gidget forgotten? Why was she deemed uncool? The short answer is, because rock and roll didn't die. The 1957 to 63 period was the pop industry trying to tame the rock and roll beast, put it in a cage, by giving the youth something that resembled it, but also directed them to ultimately conform to society's norms. But in so doing, by creating this space of a few years when the kids are allowed to have some fun, it allowed for the emergence of youth culture, a world in which the youth could determine its own rules. And within this world, the memory of the rock and roll explosion of 55, the thrill of bursting out of 50s conformity in an ecstatic scream of glee, was not forgotten. Beatlemania brought it back and made it a mainstay of this culture. Throughout the rock and roll period, there existed a youth culture in which, every few years, a new generation would rise and revolt, driven by a new musical experience, to set new values of what was cool and what was irrelevant. It was a lot of fun, it kept youth culture revitalized and fresh, and it enriched pop culture with numerous musical masterpieces. But there was a price to pay.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna be a father. Don't you have anything to say to me?
Oh, sure. You're a dead man. It's all over. Today is the first day of the end of your life.
Hey, I'm looking forward to being a father. To hear my child say its first words, take its first steps.
Yeah, keep that in mind when you're at the newsstand at 3 a.m., praying they'll be asleep before you get home with your copy of Heine. What a grand gesture. Yeah, soon my hellhounds will be out of the house and I'll be free. Except for her. God, I feel great. I'm almost happy. Let me revel in it.
Al, I think this might be a good time to
Not
tell
now,
you
babe. Once my kids leave the house, I'll finally be able to do what every man is supposed to do. I can watch TV. I can... Well, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. It's still better than having a screaming, crapping, money-sucking little vampire bobsledding me to the cemetery.
This is Al Bundy, of the popular sitcom Married with Children. The vampires on this show are Al's wife and kids, who are slowly sucking his life away. The show premiered in 1987 as a satire of all those 80s sitcoms that presented the American family as an idyllic unit. But it became a lot more than that. It is not only one of the funniest sitcoms of all time, but also a show that cleverly and brutally satirized everything about the rock and roll period, showing the sad and lame aspects of it. It ran for 11 seasons, ending in 1997, just as Buffy was starting. I shall occasionally use clips of it to demonstrate the cultural decay that Buffy was reacting to. What we see here is the outcome of 4 decades of youth culture. Because the youth were now dictating everything, it meant that by the time you reached 30, you were a has-been. You could no longer understand contemporary culture, no longer take part in it. You were doomed to live in the small circle of your family and friends, slaving your life away for the sake of your children, and having nothing to do recreationally, except watch TV. At least, this is how it seemed when you were in your youth years. Adult life seemed like a boring routine that lasts for decades on end, until you die. While the modern age was about how to grow up and become a successful adult, then in 1965, the end of the modern age, The Who announced, "I hope I die before I get old." And old meant over 30. There seemed to be only one way out. Use the years of youth to be someone. That is, to become famous. Then, it was believed, you can avoid sinking into a routine, and extend your youth years indefinitely, live a life of careless play and no work. But if you failed to do it in your youth, that was it. It was very rare for someone over 30 to achieve fame. Of course, most people, once they reached adulthood, realized that there actually is life after youth, and that work and family can be fulfilling. But not everyone. While Married with Children was supposed to be unrealistic satire, many family men identified with the misfortunes of its hero, feeling like it realistically portrayed their life much better than any other family sitcom. Al Bundy could have been someone. He was an elite football player in high school, destined for the NFL, but then he knocked up Peggy, missed his chance, and was saddled with terrible wife and kids, and a job that he hates. All he can do is reminisce about his high school glory days, and cry about his wasted life. This was one of the fears of the rock and roll period, and this is also the story dramatized in Witch.
Her nickname was Catherine the Great. She took that team and made them tri-county champions. You know, no one's ever done that before, or since. She and my dad were homecoming king and queen. They got married right after graduation.
It's kind of romantic.
Well, he was a big loser. Never made any money. Ran off with Miss Trailer Trash when I was 12.
Catherine, Amy's mother, was a legendary cheerleader in high school, but her adult life was a failure. All that's left for her are memories of her glory days, which she now tries to relive through Amy, whom she blames for taking away her life. We mentioned how kids were traditionally expected to grow up into the roles preordained for them by society. The modern age, with its focus on individuality, allowed for more freedom, but still, since the bourgeoisie focused on work, those who managed to build a business expected their children to eventually take it over. The rock and roll period, with its focus on youth rebellion, put an end to that, and kids wanted to be different from their parents. But here we see it coming all the way around. Catherine doesn't want Amy to follow her footsteps in the adult world, but to repeat what she did in the years of youth. This was actually a known thing, parents vicariously reliving their youth days through their children. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a show that deals with metaphors, cleverly turns it into a story of a wicked witch mother who goes as far as possessing her daughter's body, in order to actually relive her high school glory. Buffy doesn't know it yet, of course. At first, she is jealous of Amy, that her mom takes such close interest in her school activities.
You know, there's this girl, Amy, and, she trains with her mom like 3 hours a day.
Uh-huh.
Sounds like her mom's pretty into it.
Sounds like her mom doesn't have a lot to do.
Joyce is a woman who did manage to make a successful transition into the adult world. The downside is that her career doesn't leave her much time for her daughter. Buffy, however, quickly learns that Catherine's involvement in Amy's life isn't a good thing, so when poor Joyce, determined to be a good mother, tries to take more interest and offer helpful advice, she only incurs the ire of her daughter.
Well, I was thinking, I know the cheerleading thing didn't work out. Maybe you should think about joining the yearbook staff. I did it. It was a lot of fun.
Not really my tip, Mom.
I was a photo editor. I got to be on every page. Made me look much more popular than I was.
And have you seen the kids that do yearbook? Nerds pick on them.
Some of the best times I had in school working on the yearbook.
Oh, this just in. I'm not you. I'm into my own thing.
Your own thing, whatever it is, got you kicked out of school, and we had to move here to find a decent school that would take you. Honey. Great parenting form. A little shaky on the dismount.
While before, Buffy wanted her mom to pay closer attention, now she pushes her away and emphasizes the difference between them. She doesn't want to become like Amy, living her entire existence to please her mother. Joyce, with her rock and roll period mindset, knows and accepts that Buffy has to do her own thing, but she fails to show it, and instead has an outburst due to the animosity she harbors towards her daughter, feeling that she ruined her previous life. She realizes right away that she messed up, and determines to try again and do a better job. Before we see where this leads to, let's talk about this episode's rock and roll moment. We have several moments, actually, but they are all connected.
That's my mom.
No. Catherine Madison. Get down with your bad self.
Get down with your bad self is the kind of thing that James Brown used to say. When the modern age died, it opened up new ways of expression. The modern idea was that man needs to grow through history until he becomes fully enlightened and capable of creating the perfect society. But the ideal of the enlightened man was based on the European man, and was consequently oppressive towards other cultures. Even those who believed in equality for black people believed that it would come only when blacks shed their African culture and become like Europeans. This is why rock and roll, that was based on rhythm and sounded like it takes us back to Africa, was so perturbing to the modern mind. James Brown, a black man, was one of the originators of rock and roll back in the mid-50s, but it didn't go far enough for him. In 1965, right at the end of the modern age, he introduced funk, which pretty much did away with things like melody and harmony associated with European music and accentuated rhythm. Funk was the sound of black people who no longer accepted that they should become like whites, but demanded to be recognized for their own culture. The things about themselves that the modern mind defined as bad, they called bad, which meant even better than just merely good. Buffy, fresh from being told off by Giles for wanting to be a cheerleader, commends Catherine for getting down with her bad self. That is, doing her own thing, despite what society says. One culture that got funk, and its message, was the gay culture. Homosexuality was traditionally persecuted by religion, and the modern age didn't make things any better, since the modern perception was that the perfect man should have healthy sexuality, and anything that was seen as deviating from it, such as homosexuality, was, again, persecuted. But with the death of the modern age, gays could finally be liberated, and homosexuality became legal in the late 60s around the Western world. Legal, but still very much stigmatized and feared, so gay culture had to remain underground, mainly in discotheques. There, the sexy rhythms of funk became the basis for disco music and culture, which thrived underground in the early 70s, and bust its way into the mainstream in the latter half of the decade.
Listen, honey, about yesterday,
That is totally Esther. Besides, it's not like you were wrong, you know? I did get kicked out of school. I'm just wacky that way.
Still, I just want you to know that despite the problems you've had...
Look, Mom, you just don't get it. And believe me, you don't want it. You know, there are just some things about being a vampire slayer that the older generation... It's a long story.
Buffy, are you feeling well?
What? Oh, I'm fine, you know? What, like I can't be in a good mood? Is it like a new house rule? Fine, you know? I was just fine, because I'm a macho, macho man. I want to be a macho man. Macho, macho man. I want to be...
This is the follow-up conversation, in which Joyce tries to apologize to her daughter. Alas, a very loopy Buffy doesn't even seem to be listening. She dismisses the whole thing, and blames it on the age gap, even as she's singing a 70s disco tune from Joyce's generation. Joyce doesn't know that her daughter is under a spell, so she ends up once again feeling like she failed to reach her. Buffy is singing Macho Man by the Village People, a disco group created specifically to put a gay campy twist on American machoism. Macho Man was the record that brought them together, and the clip shows them singing it while bodybuilding in the gym, which is probably why Buffy thought of it as she was getting herself prepped for cheerleader practice. But the fact that she even sings it shows us something, because disco was considered extremely uncool in the 80s and into the early 90s. A backlash against disco and against gay culture sent the gays back into their discos, hated and reviled by the conservative spirit that took over the 80s. But then, disco gave birth to a musical revolution that eventually, in the mid-90s, made disco acceptable again. In their discos, the DJs accentuated precisely the traits that were so hated about disco, distilled and purified them, and came up with house music, which, in the late 80s, served as the basis for a new musical revolution. Rave music overtook Europe and made its way to America as well, as we see in the cheerleader tryouts, where Amber is performing a truly hot dance to music by the European rave band, Too Unlimited. This stream, from funk to disco to rave, constitutes the victory of African ecstatic dance over European structured dance. It was part of the sexual revolution, part of the process in which Western people broke out of old Puritanism and learned to enjoy their body. The rock and roll period, with its elevation of youth, celebrated youth virility, and anyone who excelled in physical activity, like cheerleaders, was considered cool. This episode gives a chance to our girls Buffy and Cordy to get down with their bad selves and show us some moves, and they are both a joy to watch, Buffy with her bouncing ponytail and Cordelia with her athleticism. Charisma Carpenter actually used to be a professional cheerleader for the NFL's San Diego Chargers, before turning to acting. She ends up being selected for the squad, and will cheerlead us throughout the high school years. Not all youth was virile, though. Nerds, those who prefer indoor activities, were very uncool in the rock and roll period, as we shall discuss in much greater detail in future episodes. This doesn't mean, however, that they weren't part of the spirit of the time. They had their own youth culture.
So maybe Amber's got this power to make herself be on fire. It's like the Human Torch, only it hurts.
Comic books are Xander's domain. Comic books used to be very popular in the Hollywood period, the first period of the pop age, and there were many different genres of comics. But some culture guardians regarded this visually provocative form of pulp fiction as the source of all of society's ills, and managed to impose a censorious code on it in 1954, only to be hit a year later by rock and roll, the new cultural menace. It seemed like comic books will die under this code, but they found a way to survive by adapting to the mindset of the rock and roll period. First, by focusing on youth comics that became more popular. Secondly, it turned out that the nerd kids, who became the main target audience, loved superheroes. After DC Comics had success in teaming their old superheroes to form the Justice League, the owner of Marvel Comics, Martin Goodman, tasked his editor-in-chief, Stan Lee, to come up with a Marvel superhero team. Lee decided to gamble and created a team of heroes who weren't all wholesome and good, like previous superheroes, but realistic people with human weaknesses. The Fantastic Four was launched in 1961 and became a sensation, showing the way forward. One of the four was the Human Torch, a 16-year-old with teenagers' problems. His mention here is a nod to the fact that our teenage superhero had precedents. This is what I'll say, for now, about youth culture in the rock and roll period. All of this will become relevant in future videos. At this point, you may be asking, do the creators really intend all those meanings that I find in the show? The answer is that it doesn't matter. The artist is never fully aware of all the meanings in their creation. They have an idea they want to convey, and that idea is their personal vision, but the vision of the artist is also partly shaped by the culture they grew into, and says things about it they might not consciously think of. Plus, while the artist has a framework that expresses this idea, when they start working on it they have to fill in the little details, and then they just choose things that seem right to them. For instance, when the creators here chose the track that the cheerleaders would dance to, they had numerous dance tracks to choose from, but they chose Twilight Zone by 2 Unlimited, probably because the title was a callback to a classic horror and sci-fi show. Our role as analyzers is to ask why this detail, in particular, appealed to them, why it works there. What we usually find is that the artist, often without realizing it, expressed something about the zeitgeist. Enough has been said already about the meanings and messages conveyed in the storylines of Buffy. This series will also inquire what hides behind the little details. But let's go back to the main storyline, as the framework is necessary to understand the little details. When Catherine, burdened by Amy's less athletic body, fails to make the cheerleading squad, she uses witchcraft to get rid of the competition. When she puts a lethal spell on Buffy, our heroes figure out that Amy is the culprit, and this leads to one of the most annoying tropes on American TV and film, when our hero suddenly becomes squeamish about killing someone, even when it is obviously the right thing to do.
How do we reverse the spell?
Well, I've been researching that, and we can reverse all the spells if we can just lay our hands on Amy's spellbook.
And if we can't get a hold of it?
Well, the other way is to cut the witch's head off.
Show of hands.
It's not Amy's fault. She only became a witch to survive her mother.
Maybe she became a witch to survive her mother, but killing and maiming people was a choice, and is her fault. If the only way to save those people is to decapitate her, then this is what you should do, even if she's human. Eventually, they figure out that the Wicked Witch is actually Catherine, and find a way to reverse her spells, leading to the final showdown. Veteran actress Robin Riker, playing our very first Monster of the Week, ensures it will be a good one, with a strong performance. Her final fate, being stuck in a statue with no ability to express herself, serves as poetic justice for a mother who imposed on her daughter a life she never wanted. The storyline we've been following, however, is the story of Buffy and her mom. After several failed interactions in a row, Joyce finally admits that
I don't get it. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about where you're coming from, how to relate to you, and I've come to a very simple conclusion. I don't get it.
I'm inscrutable, huh?
You're 16. I think there's a biological imperative whereby I can't understand you because I'm not 16.
this was the story of the rock and roll period. The youth were in their own world, creating the values of their generation, and the adults were incapable of understanding it. It was still true in 1997, but then the internet came along, ushering in the cyber period. On the internet, you are ageless. 8-year-olds can hang in the same place as 80-year-olds, forming a community together. Suddenly, through social media, it became possible to be someone, to gain many followers, even if you are over 50. Of course, there are many things in Buffy and Joyce's relationship that are still relatable, but those who are watching today might not get some of the dynamics of this other era. In Season 1, the dynamics belonged very much to the rock and roll period. But things were about to change.
Do you ever wish you could be 16 again?
Oh, that's a frightful notion. Go through all that again? Not even if it helped me understand you.
I love you, Mom.
I don't get it.
This is already a change, showing that we have begun the transitional phase. After decades of I hope I die before I get old, of dreading the time we shall have to grow up, conform, and become boring middle-class adults, we are now told that once you reach adulthood, you come to realize it is better than youth, and that you'd rather die than going back there again. As the show will progress, we shall see the death of youth culture, the transition into the cyber period, happening in real time.